Hello everyone. In today's video, I'm going to explain, or rather, attempt to reach a better understanding of Kisukes Bankai, Kannonberaki Benihime Aratame. Because I don't think his Bankai's capabilities were made clear enough, you'll probably end up with more questions than answers, so think of this as more of a discussion. I will be leaving timestamps in the comment section so you can skip to the part that you find most interesting. Anyway, let's get started. Starting off, I'll talk about the type of Bankai that it is. Certain Bankais take the form of a living being that can actually feel and think for itself. An example is Mayuri's Bankai, that takes the form of a baby. I know that's kind of weird. And in one particular incident, the time it swallowed Xyloparu, it was revealed to us that it did that without Mayuri's permission. And another example is how one of Shunsui's Zanpakuto spirits, Katen, appears when he activated his Bankai. Although I want to make it clear that her appearance is not the Bankai itself. She appears alongside the Bankai. And lastly, others like Komamura's Bankai, Kukujo Tengen Myo, are simply inanimate non-living objects that take a humanoid form, or at least the form of a living being. Kisukes Bankai seems to be of the latter type. Kannonberaki Benihime Aratame did not talk, and when Kisuke and her were collapsing due to Asukin's gift ball, it did not appear that she was in pain, and she made no expression whatsoever. Lastly, which is the most obvious, is that the sword itself does not turn into the Bankai. Kisuke retains his unsealed basic sword. It would be interesting to know whether he can use his Shikai abilities in Bankai or not. Now, Kisukes Bankai or Kannonberaki Benihime Aratame, saying this will get old real quick. It actually already did. Anyway, she cuts off at the abdominal area, kinda like a Susanoo, and I'm not sure whether she has legs or not. She's wearing a dress that covers her lower body, so we cannot really tell. We don't know whether she can move around or not. I don't know whether you guys realize this, but Benihime was at the Benihime figure was at the location where Kisuke released his Bankai. But after him and Asukin move across the landscape, and after Asukin's defeat while they were talking, Benihime was not behind Kisuke. But suddenly, when Kisuke was collapsing as the poison got more concentrated, after Asukin's defeat, the Benihime statue is then seen behind Kisuke collapsing as well. So did she move there? Because mind you, it was on top of a building. Or was it Kisuke trying to use her resurrection abilities and that's why she appeared? Is it that she appears behind him anytime she is going to be used? Keep in mind these questions because they are going to be kind of relevant in the next segment. This is going to get kind of complicated, so get ready. As far as we know, or from what we have been shown, is that his Bankai has two abilities. Number 1, dissection. Number 2, resurrection/reconstruction. Although, you could argue that it is actually only really one ability, and that the dissection and reconstruction are two phases of one or a single process. The process being the resurrection. Resurrection is in quotations here because resurrection implies some form of coming back to life after death, which we don't know if his Bankai is capable of doing. I doubt it could though. His Bankai's ability to dissect is symbolic or relates in part to her name, that part being Kannonberaki. This segment, or the next segment, will get into a discussion on the Japanese language, so skip ahead if you find that boring. You've been warned. Don't complain later on. Now, the Japanese language has characters called kanji. The alphabet or letters in English, the equivalent to that in Japanese are katakana and hiragana. These represent sounds like A, B, C, D, etc. Kanji, on the other hand, are characters that may represent a concept, an idea, or even a thing or an action. That symbol/character you see, for example, on the Hokage hat is a kanji, and that kanji in that particular case represents fire. So kanjis are kind of like logos. There is not really an English equivalent. But if I had to, I'm not saying they're the same thing, but I'm saying if I had to give an example, I would compare it to, for example, the tilted swastika that represents the Nazis and the peace symbol that represents peace, for example. Now, there are two things that you need to keep in mind. Number one, a single kanji can be made up of a combination of different kanjis. Number two, a string of kanjis put together can be used to represent or communicate an idea separate from, note, separate from the individual kanjis in the string. Again, these aren't the same, but I'm just trying to give an example so that people could understand better. The word sandwich in English, for example, has sand in it, but there is no sand in sandwiches. Kannon, and this is what I think is happening in this particular case when interpreting Kisukes Bankai's name. Kannonberaki is made up of 3 kanjis. This string of 3 kanjis means or translates to the string together translates to either opening double doors from the center or a method of filleting a fish with a central cut and pushing back its flesh. So the first part of this string or kanji happens to be kannon. Kannon being the Japanese version of a Southeast Asian Buddhist deity called Avalokiteshvara. I say deity because Avalokiteshvara has divine status but is not the common concept of god or goddess, whose gender may depend on the culture the deity is being portrayed by. This is why you find a discrepancy in the translations. The official Viz translation, for example, translates Kannonberaki Benihime Aratame to Opened Red Princess Neo, and makes no mention of this deity Avalokiteshvara or Kannon, because people thought that her abilities would be symbolic to that deity or religious figure in some way. And as we've seen, Kannonberaki is more of a reference to the dissection ability than anything else, and a chapter is literally called the Princess Dissection. Now, some would still argue that the Kannon bit is a reference to this divine figure because his Bankai looks like a female statue or whatnot. And to that, this is what I have to say. The huge female avatar or statue or figure in a red dress is already and obviously a reference to the Red Princess part of the name. If what you argue is true, then there would be 2 references, a reference to a red/crimson princess and a reference to a deity. Which is it? Now we talk about what the ability actually does, and even this will get a little complicated, so I've made a few illustrations to make things clearer, so stay tuned for that. Now firstly, what is definitely stated and what is made clear are the following. Number 1, it has a range. Outside the range, its effects cease to manifest. 2, it can make dissections. And I think it's worth mentioning that the dissections do not seem to be painful at all. Number 3, following the dissection is a reconstruction that occurs by stitching close the region that has been dissected. There are 2 observations that you need to keep in mind with regards to the stitching. The stitching threads are permanent if and only if the process is not interrupted or if you do not go outside the range during the process. However, the stitching threads appear even if you do go outside the range. However, they appear only to reverse the dissection that has appeared before the interruption. As we've seen, even though Askin went outside the range, there were threads that appeared to return his arm to how it was initially. So, the best analogy that I can make for Kisukes Bankai's ability is how, for example, if you've seen a Lego construction that is mediocre or bad, so what you do is you break it down and you rebuild it into the same thing or a better one. That's the principle of his Bankai's ability. At least I think. Before I go on further, I want to keep an important observation in your minds. This observation is that whenever and wherever you see those threads, that means that region has been dissected. This will be important with regards to the threads involved with Grimjow's entry. Next, I want to mention how the dissections are not really cuts in the general meaning of being cut. The dissections from his Bankai, as we've discussed, don't seem to cause pain. Blood does not discharge from the dissections, at least during the process. So it does not seem like Kisuke can use it to just slice an opponent's neck, for example. The dissections are part of a particular process. Anything dissected is stitched back, as we have discussed. And if the process is interrupted, it is stitched back to normal without permanent stitches. The color scheme of the dissections is seen in the Bleach Brave Souls game, and it looks beautiful. And I'll insert a clip here.
Bankai Kannonberaki Benihime Aratame. 仕方ないっすね。おやらですいません。
Now, I'll talk about aspects of the Bankai that may not be very clear. Number 1 is the range. I questioned whether the range is from Kisuke outwards or from the Benihime statue/figure outwards. For this one, I have an answer. I think it is from Kisuke outwards, and that is because of one reason. The reason is that after Asukin ran away from the Bankai's range, by the way, those circles you see are the Hirankyaku, after which Kisuke then dashes and slashes Asukin. However, even though Kisuke was away from the Benihime figure, Kisuke was able to dissect and stitch back his hand, and this happened at a distance that was established to be outside the Bankai's range. Number 2 is the requirement of contact or the requirement of the Benihime statue to touch you is not very clear. To revive his eyes, the Benihime figure placed its hands above his eyes as he said that it resurrects anything it touches. But then later on, there was no necessity for that when he was stitching back his hand after it was dissected when he clashed with Asukin. Now, two things can be happening. We could nitpick. We could say, technically, what he said was that it can resurrect anything it touches, which is not the same or a confirmation or not the same as saying it can only resurrect things it has touched. Or it could be a necessity if the part to be dissected is already damaged, because that is what the word resurrect implies. Resurrect implies that something is coming back from a damaged or a different state. So maybe the requirement of the contact is only for parts that were already damaged. Number 3, we are not sure whether Benihime's resurrection is permanent or not, because upon keener observation, when Kisuke was collapsing, we could see blood coming from the stitches, and on one side there were no stitches and his flesh seemed to have been exposed. Now we don't know what that means, or whether that means he'll lose his eyesight again, or whether the only drawback is that the places that have been dissected and stitched can have the stitches undone, therefore exposing the inner parts of the body. Now, the next thing I'll be discussing is not really about his abilities in particular, but how he got Grimmjow into the gift ball and the entrance through which Nell entered. So there is reason to think that Nell and Grimmjow entered from two different places. Remember how we discussed that anywhere you see the stitches indicates that the region has been dissected. So it may be the case that Grimmjow actually entered from the ground, as we've seen stitches in the ground that terminate at the spot where Askin gets his heart removed. Here in this panel, you can see an unstitched region of Benihime's dissection, which may be from where Grimmjow came out of, and how Askin did not see him coming. Now regarding Nell, I don't know whether you guys realize this, but the entrance through which Nell dashed into has stitches around it. Plus, Nell looked out for an entrance, and the very fact that she looks for an entrance is consistent if she entered from a different spot than Grimmjow. Otherwise, it would make no sense, because she would have seen where Grimmjow entered from as she was waiting outside and would not need to look for an entrance. Now, some might argue that Nell just arrived late because, a little reminder, Kisuke was with Shunsui and the other captains and vice captains. Nell was with Ichigo, the gang, Yoruichi, and Grimmjow, but they split apart to look for Grimmjow as he impatiently left them behind to fight Askin. But that's irrelevant, because Kisuke met Grimmjow and spoke with Nell on his way to Yoruichi, so Nell should have been there overlooking the fight since Kisuke joined. Unless you think that she's too slow, which I don't think is a good reason. Next is the little bit of confusion I had with regards to how Kisuke was capable of accessing the outside. As he says that he made the path from the outside in, not from the inside out. Those threads you see are coming from the outside, not from the inside. These are the illustrations I made in an attempt to visualize what I think happened. So Askin was in the Bankai's range when Kisuke released it. Askin then moved out of it. Then they clashed when Kisuke dissects and stitches back his hand. Now, this is important. Askin, as mentioned by himself, was within Kisuke's range at this point when they were clashing. It seems that it was part of Kisuke's plan to use physical force in order to push Askin back or towards the border of the gift ball deluxe. Why is that? Because I think Kisuke was capable of accessing the outside because he moved closer to the border, such that the outside of the border was within the range of Kisuke's Bankai. And as we've discussed, anything within its range can be dissected. So I hope you guys have had a better understanding from my video, and let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!